Okay, this recording is going to be a continuation of the speculation that corresponds to the video. I'm not sure what I'm going to actually title the video, but the raw file name is something like Voice 006 to 007 Thought Catalog Self-Discovery hyphen psych. So, I'm talking about the explanation of the variance within my metagram type. And I'm trying to talk about sort of the archetype of the stupid INTJ and the clever INTJ. Well, I'm just saying clever in relative to the stupid INTJ, although usually the INTJ is not called clever, it's just called an INTJ. But just to make it distinct from the so-called stereotypical stupid INTJ, and I believe that both of these variants come from within the exact same metagram type. Now, okay, so here I think is perhaps a perfect example as to why particular circuits lead to particular permutations of a kind of developmental obstacle. So I've got, I think, a more probing and a better explanation as to what is happening to make this metagram type manifest as a so-called stupid INTJ. And I think that I have personal history and experience of this. This was a developmental challenge that I sort of went through, and I think that perhaps I also didn't do it perfectly or as well as I could have, potentially, or maybe it was a necessary sort of self-maiming. But anyway, let me get into describing this. So I think that what is happening is that the difference between a clever INTJ and a stupid INTJ is not even the stimulus, although that they might have some contributing factor to it, because the balance of subordination and power between the two emotional tones that make up the elemental signature cloned stimulus is perhaps going to be the thing that provides the impetus towards how the emergent response gets structured. And anyway, so I think that what essentially happens with the stupid INTJ is that the primary counteroffer is actually consorting with the non-cornered emotional response, emergent response. The two emotional tones that make up the emergent response, one of them is the more natural consort and partner to the primary counteroffer because they share the same corner. The other one is ulterior, is just the elemental clone of the one that is in the corner with the primary counteroffer. And so if that particular metagram type instead gets into a preference of connecting their emergent response or subordinating the proper counterpart to the primary counteroffer, if instead they have a preference to utilizing the other emotional tone in their emergent response, which is not in the corner connected with the primary counteroffer, then they can kind of develop an isolated emergent response that doesn't, because you see what should naturally happen, and perhaps this is a problem that plagues everyone that has a cloned emergent response, or that has an emergent response that has two emotional tones, which has a cloned elemental signature, because then there is the possibility that you use the non-cornered emergent response emotional tone as a crutch, as a way to take a holiday from having your primary counteroffer internally regulated, or so there's a kind of pressure release valve that you can sort of still deploy an emergent response, but do so in such a way that it doesn't counteract one's own primary counteroffer. And so you can kind of establish the presence, the overbearing presence of an unconscious projection as well as an egoic contending, or an egoic judgment that can seemingly both get a bite of the same cherry, that they can both be present in the same room without the internal check that the normal natural corner that would cause them to be in a fundamental agitation to one another, that at least the use of the one would trespass on the use of the other, and therefore they would have to find some kind of parallel response. And therefore, in other types that don't have this pressure release valve, there's probably a proclivity towards either therefore being unconscious focused or egoic focused to the detriment of the other, whereas what makes the stupid INTJ stupid is that they can get away with a kind of self-deception because they can sort of take two bites from the same cherry, if you can catch this drift. So so that might be what is actually driving the sort of the immaturity, or at least the kind of that you have almost the same machinery as an INTJ, but you have a kind of self-deception, or perhaps even a kind of blind spot that is so large because there is no internal balancing between the unconscious and the ego, because the emergent response and the primary counteroffer, or the emergent response is being channeled in such a structurally unsound way relative to the normal sort of check and balance of the structure of the metatype, or structure of the metagram circuit within the metatype, that then therefore the metatype is metastasizing the kind of the worst version of itself, this kind of contrived and over-rationalized sort of perhaps the word overdetermined, I could even use that as a nice adjective, that this is a kind of overdetermined kind of contrivance engine, which seemingly makes very unilateral, very convenient suppositions, which probably manifest as something like a kind of autistic field of kind of selectively editing your rationalization in order to arrive at the conclusion that you were unilaterally anticipating in the first place. Now, it's interesting because I think that each possible emergent response out of the two emotional tones that make up the elemental clone signature, each in some sense are a separate personality, are a separate circuit in some way. And I remember in my own development that I chided the other personality circuit. I actually considered it to be fundamentally erroneous, fundamentally incoherent, because it lacked this kind of internal check and balance. And I ended up sort of shunning it and actually sort of destroying it, but or suppressing it rather. And it kind of fought back. And I do think that sort of I've made this claim before that my metagram type is special for many, many different reasons, perhaps as well. But I think that in the balancing between a cloned emergent response, you can, perhaps that might be the only door to, sorry, let me just take a step back and set this up properly. One of the huge problems that I have in theoretically speculating and working on the integration between metagram and metatype is that I don't know what the end point is. I don't know what's possible. I don't know if it's, I've for a large time now, I have been I'm theoretically working toward the maximum being that it is possible to completely overcome metagram circuitry, and it is also possible perhaps to completely overcome metatype, and that you can become a kind of alti-type or a multi-type or something like that, that you can kind of completely jailbreak all of these structures. That might not be possible. It might be that the only way to actually bring balance to a particular type is that it just has to have enough kind of self-knowledge that it fills in the structural proclivities towards dysfunction. And so essentially people need each other, essentially is going to be something like people need to learn from each other and garner enough insight from each other in order to paper over their own intrinsic fundamental incapability, because we are all going to have our particular strengths and weaknesses, and although we can graft each other into ours, that's a kind of psychological alchemy. It's not, and essentially the one exception to this is something like someone who has really the full shining sun, the full day, the midday sun of variant of the gift of the apostle. That the gift of the apostle has within itself the full capability to make the discerning of spiritual names, and the location or the rendering of these fundamental spiritual identities is in some sense the fundamental undergirding foundation upon which that there can be integration for other types as well. So there's a kind of the apostle is kind of like the skeleton, or the of the body of the self-actualized. And so that would make the point, and this somewhat conforms with what one of the latest sort of jolts of inspiration that I had, which was that metagram circuitry perhaps is the blood. And if metagram circuitry is the blood, and essentially it cannot be you can't walk out of it. You can't sort of transcend the blood. You'll always be in that channel of manifestation. Then in some sense, this places more of an emphasis on experiential wisdom and on seeking and searching and the pursuit of this of the truth. First seek the kingdom of God, as it says in the scriptures, and that is in some sense something that is so I'm trying to think of the word that means the negative of that. It can't be uncoupled. It's impossible to untether that from the blood. Anyway, but that there is a blood, there is a metagram that is capable of actually fully ascending to the full rendering of the gift of the apostle, which then is essentially the foundation stone, the cornerstone of the body of Christ, as it were, in relation to the Christian doctrine. Anyway, what is my point? Okay, so after saying that if my type is the special type, is the type that is capable of contenting the gift of the apostle, it's because there is some kind of special jailbreaking, almost walking on water way in which the type itself can transcend metatype, which is what I have explored when I'm talking about bipolar type 1 to some degree, that in the and how that occurs is through the non-cornered emergent response corresponding to the primary counteroffer. That is the jailbreaking, walking on water transcendence of metatype, or at least gaining a scope of the 17 model beyond the subjective false ego complex. Because it's capable of essentially creating a virtual primary counteroffer that is completely detached from both even the superego, but also from the edifice that it's operating from, which is essentially, or that it's breaking out of, which is, the particular false ego complex that is precipitating this virtual primary counteroffer that is completely unrelated to everything. And so you end up with actually a virtual primary counteroffer that has no it has no subscription in the false ego complex. It has no obligation. It has no duty to karma. It has no duty to the blood even as well. It kind of goes beyond the blood. And it is just made up of two emotional tones. So in some sense, you get access to one emotional tone that has the use of one emotional tone, which has absolutely no commitment to anything. And let me just check what it actually is. So in my metagram type, which is 1 out of 48 metagram types, the virtual primary counteroffer that is precipitated by the uncornered emotional response, which it can kind of is excited. And excitement is literally dimension 12 over dimension 4. I think, let me just see if it's a negatory or positive emotional tone. I'm not entirely sure. How it's written here, it's written as a positive, that it's dimension 12 above dimension 4, which is actually reason above the water. It is, the face of God above, that hovered above the water. If dimension 4 is the water and dimension 12 is the light of reason, the light of consciousness, the light of love, the first thing that God created into. But yeah, sorry. Let me just double check what excited is. Excited is. Yeah, it's a positive. It's not a negative. It is experiencing a sense of what things should be like, distinguished by a stronger grasp of why those things are a particular way. That is what excited is. So, there is a pristine act. There is a door to an emotional tone which has no commitment to any other emotional tone, and it's a positive emotional tone. And I would say that this might be the lever upon which all substantiation essentially rests. So maybe it's the hidden crown languishing in the the king that is drowning in the pool of the underworld, which was the prophecy by Carl Jung, which is that the king cries out to any who would save me from drowning. I will place into his right hand the morning star and the philosopher's stone. Oh, maybe that's what the morning star is. Maybe that excited is what the morning star is. Okay, so wielding that virtual window of access into that. Now, the problem is that if you don't have a tenable connection it's interesting, because I think that what the stupid INTJ is perhaps doing is that they are autistically accessing this power, but it's not relatable to the cornered correspondence. In fact, the cornered correspondence between the emergent response and the primary counteroffer is actually damaged in order to unilaterally access this. So it's like, and they privilege this virtual access. So the whole thing is that can it be hooked up? Can it be bridged through the emergent response working together? And, you know, in recordings a long time ago, I was talking a lot about you know, in Revelations it talks about the two witnesses in sackcloth that eventually get killed and then get resurrected as well, but and that they bring the weather to because they minister of they minister the word of God to these cities, and I kind of extrapolate from that, or slightly, and I say that actually the two witnesses can also be seen to slightly reframe this, just to explore it and tease into it a bit, is that they're actually two cities in a way, and that these two cities have to sort of be intersecting one another, and that their footprints have anyway, I went into a lot of those details, and I think that this exactly corresponds with this issue, and that is perhaps what is being described in Revelations, is that it's talking about the proper integration that leads to, in some sense, the discovery, because this will, the revealing of the gift of the apostle is something that everyone has to graft onto. It's something that everyone has to inculcate within themselves. And so if they see it on the outside, they still have to, it still has to be born within them. It has to be born out within them. It has to awaken within them. They have to enter into its realization, and they have to, in some sense, no matter where it comes from, it will come from their own spiritual discerning. But in terms of how it's modeled to them in the medium of the world, as it were, it has to be recapitulated inside their own spiritual discerning. And anyway, so this is the thing that we all have to go through. I'm somewhat conforming with my other prior claim that everything that happens in the mind and in society and in culture is on some level modeled first from a psychological personality. It you know, we have strewn around us and about us relics and elements of things that exist within particular personalities, mechanisms and features and products of the functioning of particular personality structures and styles. Anyway, okay, so let me just focus on this more. So, look, I remember thinking that just focusing on this and, let's say, diminishing the coherence of the corner within my personality style was a mistake, was an egregious mistake. Because in some sense, if I subordinated the corner to unilaterally access this virtual primary counteroffer, or let's say to privilege the non-cornered emergent response, that would lead to a very egregious and very unjust and very incorrect I can't think of the exact right word, but a kind of a fabricated, but also a kind of a very mean-spirited almost, hobbling and maiming of the cornered symmetry within my personality style. And in some sense, it's very painful to disconnect from this other emergent response, because it's so enlightening, as it were. It's so, and I actually said to myself that that the one must take precedence over the other, which is perhaps not the perfect road to take, but I thought it was the safest road to take. That in some sense, the only way to fix this and not to be overrun by the there were probably other reasons as well, because I wanted to understand the false ego complex without sort of just jailbreaking myself as well. So I was being very mean with myself perhaps as well, but I thought that that was better than perhaps being, sorry, there are lots of sort of components of this, but I mean, it's so much better to be excited than to be annoyed. But and perhaps, the real ideal is that from a pristine and prime emotional tone of excited, one can, from that prime lever and prime driver, see that as the initiating source of fuel in all the field circuits, that it moves from there on out. It moves from there, it proceeds from there to every other field circuit. And then if you track, that might be sort of the correct pristine, that might be sort of the the kind of the paradise, order of operation of reasoning, or going, you first reason from there, and then you proceed to whichever other emotional tone you want to have an output there too. And that might be how you have an integration, therefore, between the integration that needs to be found within my metagram type is by finding the symmetry there, or finding the parallel, correct way of reasoning from excited to annoyed, so that my annoyed is yoked and tethered to the pristine singular lever that should be the prime motivating thing. And then the emergent responses will both be able to be balanced and activated simultaneously. And maybe the stimulus then falls away. Maybe that is the end game, is that it's not the emergent response and primary counteroffer that becomes eclipsed when you self-actualize. That remains, that the unconscious and the ego continue to function, but that the subconscious essentially ascends into a different state that is, in some sense, purely the metatype state, which is integrated with all the other dimensions of that essentially integrates seamlessly with the whole water structure of the 17 model of metatype. So in some sense, it's maybe that is the actual golden ascension, as it were, or the gold of truth that is reached at the end of the journey. The precipitate of the Philosopher's Stone is that it is the subconscious that that sort of becomes universal in a sense, but the ego and the unconscious metagram is what makes someone a particular incarnated and also still in use of the blood. But the blood is seamlessly fueling the transcended subconscious. So to translate this into Keegan stages, it would be that Keegan stage 2 in fact is the end game. Which was interesting because I pretty much had the same argument against Ken Wilber. And I was even able to defeat a lot of his rationalization and when we were debating these things. And he did concede to me many times that I had broken his model. But he continued to try to re-surmount the same kind of... Anyway, but... and that's what happens when you try to make essentially, you without an accurate model, without a precise, directly, there's nothing to substitute proper investigation. You can't just kind of cash out a narrative, kind of construct and then rely on that sort of approximate system. There's no substitute for actual direct investigation. Anyway, so I'm very happy now because I think that a lot of these things that I've just outlined are very workable. Now that obviously is a solution for my kind of circuit. And I wonder if it is, it might not, I wonder if it is true. Because the reason why I think excited is the prime lever that is actually capable of being pristine is because the excited emotional tone is purely abstract. And so if that is the first, if that is used as a principle, it can actually be used as a principle. Because it's only made up of dimension 4 and dimension 12. It's only made up of water and the light that was first created. And the light is placed above the water. Moderation with a stronger component of liberty. Moderation, the 4th dimension, SI, and liberty, the 12th dimension of psychological reality, NI. Experiencing a sense of what things should be like, distinguished by a stronger grasp of why those things are a particular way. So if it is true that excited is the necessary thing that holds everything else up, and that there might be other emotional tones that have their primary counter. This might really be the way to do it, is to actually, using my model of field circuits, I know where excited is in the field circuits, and I know how all the field circuits are connected. Then you just draw a line from excited to where somebody else's primary counter offer is, and you just essentially lay out a kind of philosophical framework that traverses that distance. And then you have, let's say, a kind of, now it's going to be more complicated than that, but essentially that would be the golden thread of truth, as it were, that could be used as a kind of, as a reference, or as a fundamental kind of measuring stick that you can then orientate your... in some sense, this is already done. There are beautiful renditions of libertarian philosophy that are integrated within essentially enough proper abstractions that they can be this is what L. Ron Hubbard did. This is what Scientology is. In some sense, this is all Scientology is reasoning from the excited emotional tone. And careful, plodding, calibrated formulations and sorry, I'm not describing this so well, but there's sort of coherent renderings of cogent thought that give you a kind of model of how to frame things. Perhaps, though, my model of how traversing through the field circuits to get to your primary counter offer from excited might be a more formulaic way of, there might be a more readily, because then in some sense you wouldn't have to tell them how to think or what to think. You could just essentially give some better illustrations about how you do that reasoning from that emotional tone to that emotional tone to that emotional tone, all the way to where your primary counter offer is, or the emotional tone that is used by your primary counter offer, which is in some sense the thing that is characterizing the identity of your unconscious, the realm of operation that is. Sorry, I was just writing how to formulate this. This is also something that I've. So, you know, if you look at my diagram of the metatype model of the psyche, there are 4 sides of the mind, and I've also imported John Vervaeke's, 4 P's: procedural for the superego, perspectival for the subconscious, participatory for the unconscious, and propositional for the ego. But before I even associated it with those 4 P's, I had my own designation, which is also still on my diagram, which is that the superego is doing, and the subconscious is be, and the unconscious is do, and the ego is have. But I'm very good at labeling things and identifying things. I'm not so good at actually always creating the long form of actually what it is that I'm even labeling, and so it is those labels of doing and be and do and have. This, I think, is the proper long form that contextualizes what those labels actually are. Is that so? When the superego is the doing, what I mean by that is that doing is the realm. And you see, this is problematic because this is so. I'm trying to describe the realm of the interior container or subcomponent of the self, subcomponent of how the self is conscious. So, it's very hard to actually try to find a grammatical way that actually frames this properly without using kind of clumsy grammar that. So I've got written here, the realm that tracks operations or that you are doing, that you are be, that you are do. So you can't actually say realm that tracks the operations. You have to say the realm what tracks operations of, that you are the doing, that you are the be, that you are the do, and that you are the have. So, for example, the unconscious is what tracks operations that you are do. And the subconscious is the realm what tracks operations that you are be. And the superego is the realm what tracks operations that you are doing. And the ego is the realm what tracks operations that you are have. And I know that still, I guess, doesn't that maybe that long form doesn't help people too much to see what I'm saying. But essentially, so when I say that the ego is the realm of have, I'm also basically saying that all you actually have in terms of consciousness is your judgment. That your capacity to render propositional commentary on your own meta, in some sense, the ego is very close to something like metacognition, because it's the thinking about your thinking, and it's weird because it's always, the ego has what you have is a kind of timeless reservoir of capacity of judgment because when is your ego true? It's true in a timeless kind of way. It's not true in a contemporaneous way. It's always sentencing things in the absolute, in the eternal. It's always, you always have that judgment, unless you have a judgment which repudiates your then prior judgment, but then it's not your prior judgment, it's the conception of your prior judgment, it's the recording of your prior judgment, and it's still the same ego, it's still the same judgment. So it's still the same source. It is the realm what tracks operations that you have. It is what you always have. That is what the ego is what you always have. And that is what the unconscious is. It is what you always do. And that is what the superego is. It is what you are always doing. And and it's weird because and the subconscious is the realm, or is what you will always be. It's the thing that performs the operation of what you be. Maybe that's the thing that performs the operation of what you have or do or be. Oh yeah, so that probably is actually the better way of framing it. And in some sense, when I say the thing in you, I mean, in some sense, it's all an abstraction. And it's, in fact, in some sense, it only exists within the ego. It only exists within what you have. It either exists within your judgment, that you can agree with what I'm saying, or you egoically repudiate what I'm saying. And then you don't, and then by your own judgment that you don't have it, So, that's when you're talking about philosophy, or psychology rather, that's the fundamental paradox, is that you can't escape that. Is that, in some sense, the only thing that can make any of this true or untrue is essentially the endorsement of people's actual epistemic agency, and that to some degree is contingent on the ego, but is also probably also contingent on the subconscious. And then just being able to jailbreak the subconscious and the superego and still retain the unconscious and the ego, I do actually really like that. I think that is actually the entire solution. Or that it's just that people do still need an augmented circuit, in that they need to, or hopefully, I mean, this is not, some sense, I'm saying this as a, this is not a metagram. I can't derive this judgment from metagram directly. I can just derive this from perhaps philosophizing about metatype, that, well, either you can be a nihilistic, skeptical solipsist, or you can, philosophically speaking, or you can actually try to flourish in the human condition. And I would submit that this is the way that the human condition is to be optimized and, dare I say, perfected. Although that perfection is a quickening that is living, and that is sort of not going to be completely immune potentially from mistakes, but it should be cleansed of being able to perform errors. But I mean, that's just to technically give the word mistake to the world to some degree, because mistake, to have a mistake of something, well, maybe what was given to you was the thing that was amiss. And so if something is handed to you and it was amiss, and then you take it, have you not made also a mistake? But, sort of getting into arguments of blame with the world is something that, you have to bootstrap it on yourself. So I say that, you have to say that you will be prone to mistakes, but you should perfect yourself in the sense that you should be immunized of erroneousness. Anyway, these are somewhat delicate semantic qualifications, but anyway, let me not get off into the weeds too much. Okay, I think I've made very good work with this recording. I think I'll have to think about this more and see if it lines up, and if this is a useful therapeutic angle to take, and also the details about how the subconscious perhaps get structured in this emergent, transcendental, self-actualized, I'll just have to just fully render out all the aspects of self-actualization according to this proximate therapeutic, I don't know really what to call it. I think that this is probably an incredibly promising. This might, fully get, that it's all coming together quite nicely. Anyway, I mean, yeah, all the major breakthroughs might have already occurred, although it will be interesting. There might be some things about the other circuits and other circuit types that I need to learn about in terms of the potential psychopathologies and breakpoints and sources of immaturity. But I think that in some sense, most sources of, in some sense, obstinate or intractable or seemingly very hard to psychological conditions that are very hard to find remedies for might likely all come from all the types that have two emotional tones in their emergent response compiled with the peculiarity or the other circuit types, so that you're going to have essentially, because I mean, you're going to have stimuluses that include corners, or you're going to have single entity stimuluses, and then you're going to have people that have two emergent responses. And depending then on if they're a single entity or they're a double circuit in terms of their stimulus, it's probably going to lead into added layers of complexity or variance in terms of how pathologies or how individuals can cycle through various pathologies. And this might also explain why cluster B personality disorders are often comorbid and are, that they can sort of be shifted from one to the other in a kind of merry-go-round. Okay, anyway, let me get into this in some future time. Okay, this is an addendum to my last recording, in which I'm going to elaborate some refinements that I was thinking about, although this is perhaps a bit stale in my mind because I've already moved on to sort of 3 other subjects that I've also been working on concurrently, so I should have made this recording earlier, but anyway, hopefully I even, when I was going over this in my mind, going over this topic, thinking about it, probing into it, this is going to take a lot of refinement, this is, because these mechanics are going to, I think, be very important, because I do think that there are many variable permutations of how this developmental obstacle essentially manifests, and I think that this could, the double-barreled or the emergent response that has two elemental that has two emotional tones that are elemental signature clones of one another, that feature is probably involved in narcissism, it's probably involved in much psychopathologies, and it's probably involved also in a lot of developmental obstacles that some people have. And I'm going to elaborate at least in the case of the stupid INTJ and the clever INTJ, as it were. So, which is an example that I'm now going to further delve into. So I haven't yet, in my own mind, I haven't gone looking for how does one find this excited emotional tone and actually trace it to the annoyed emotional tone, which is my primary counter offer, to see if I can balance out my emergent responses. But I might be touching on some periphery tangential topics that will involve that, but I haven't done any proper investigation yet into how tenable that kind of almost sort of how how what's the word? How readily dispensable, as in that you're capable of giving it to someone in a kind of clinical, or writing a book about it, and providing some kind of self-help, like how useful it's going to be, how workable it's going to be. So I haven't investigated that yet. I just wanted to point that out, and that's probably a more interesting thing to get into. But because that is slightly one of the more speculative things, I do think that I've made a breakthrough, and the breakthrough is essentially in properly understanding some of the mechanics, or at least having a good view of it in my mind, of what's going on with this emergent response, and what's going on with many juvenile or immature sort of, or the lack of maturity, or as a developmental obstacle, how it manifests as a developmental obstacle with people. And I've also have other things to talk about in terms of how this potentially relates to bipolar, and also how it I will give some anecdotal sort of things about how I see some of these mechanics playing out in my own development of my own personality style, of my metagram type. Just to get some kind of baseline, just to get some broad overview picture of all the things that are potentially going on around this topic. Now, obviously, the thing that I'm not going to be able to touch on properly here is how much of this, because I'm just focusing on the relationship between the primary counteroffer and the emergent response. But it might be that the different circuit types as related to the stimulus, because some stimuluses are single entity of some metagram circuits, and some stimuluses are double-barreled, and they are corner stimuluses, or they are elemental signature clone stimuluses. And the variant of my metagram type is that my stimulus is an elemental clone double-barreled kind of stimulus. So I'm not properly taking that into account as I'm trying to laser focus in on primary counteroffer and emergent response, and it might be that these things will also have a more complicated variation in terms of how they correspond to the different types of stimulus. And that complexity I won't be dealing with in talking about this now. So that might revise what I'm about to say now. But anyway, I have to start somewhere, and then go back and forth, perhaps until it all sort of comes out nicely. Anyway, seemingly coherent and workable. Okay, so what I think is happening with this with the immaturity of the stupid INTJ, which I do think is a kind of immaturity, and again, I am notwithstanding what I don't know about how the stimulus impacts on this, because there might also be features of the stimulus, and in some sense, whatever the emergent response and the primary counteroffer are doing with one another, there is going to be some correspondence in what the stimulus is doing. And the stimulus is going to be anchoring that structure, or at least seemingly supporting it, because the emergent response in the stimulus does have a kind of parallel self-referencing kind of positive feedback with one another. So there's going to be an imprint of this somewhere in the stimulus, and the stimulus is going to have some kind of sympathetic structure correlated to the kind of whatever juvenile structure is happening or occurring between the primary counteroffer and the emergent response. But just talking about the emergent response by itself is a good enough proxy, because the emergent response is going to have, yes, it's going to have a sympathetic structure with the stimulus, but just talking about it by itself, in terms of how it's relating to the primary counteroffer, I think is perhaps, in the final analysis, although I haven't focused on the stimulus yet, I think might turn out to be the proximate reduction that is a viable way to look at this in a kind of complete developmental pattern, or at least in terms of how people are strewn or stuck within a particular developmental obstacle of which I'm about to describe. Okay, so I think the developmental problem is essentially that because, and I've already gone through this somewhat laboriously, but I'm going to add more extrapolation to it, that when the primary counter offer is corresponding with the non-cornered emergent response, what I think is actually then happening is that the non-paired emergent response is being activated in the ego, but the ego itself is not taking responsibility for that. The identity of the self in terms of the ego is being projected on an external object. So there's this, which is also a kind of paradox. So the ego is saying, I am a cloud ego. I'm an ego that haunts and is the atmosphere that properly sits around and encapsulates everyone in my view, in the egoic view. And so this ego has no sense of an external locus of control and an internal locus of control. They are fundamentally confused in the same thing, that there is only one thing. In some sense, it's partly the view that there is a kind of, and this might also in some sense be related to the fact that the ego and the superego is being naively interlaced or interwoven or intersecting one another. And so the ego is already in a very naive and primitive sense is kind of categorically assuming the role and the power of the superego, something like that. And so the ego gives itself the latitude to stretch itself over other people's minds. And so we are talking about a kind of solipsism or autism. This is, I think, almost the quintessential sort of philosophical way of describing what autism essentially is. And so if your ego speaks to your environment or speaks to the other minds in your environment, then you've sort of dissolved the boundary between individuals. But collectively under the title or under the tutelage of your ego being the prime judge or something like that, and then there is some kind of, relative to the unconscious side of the mind, relative to the participatory identity, there is some tact which is being used. The primary counteroffer is being used in a very ham-fisted way, just to kind of prospectively extend the grasp of the ego, that the primary counteroffer is just really there to aid the ego in its overextension, or its kind of prospective sort of colonization of its surroundings. Now, I'm somewhat speaking around what I wanted to say much sooner is that, so when this projection is happening, essentially the ego does not take responsibility for the emergent response that is not cornered. The ego says, no, people in my, so if this was happening in my metagram type, in my metagram personality style, it would be ascribing that other people are always silly. It would be, oh, look at all these silly people. They're constantly being silly. And labeling other people as silly is a way to sort of escape your own ego and to escape your own cornered emergent response. So you don't have to take responsibility for your own cornered emergent response and have your own ego saddled with that identity, because you can just see it through other people's eyes and how silly other people are being, or something like that. And so in some sense it's dependent on a kind of okay, I haven't phrased this so nicely, but essentially this is the apportionment of this emotional tone onto other people in your environment. And therefore, you can use that as your sort of reference point to emulate something like an ego, but it's an ego that overlooks your own cornered emergent response. And then essentially the thing that sort of ties this into a bow, and I maybe haven't described this so nicely, but essentially this is what I think codependency is that it's your emergent response. It's your identity in your ego, but you are projecting it onto somebody else, and then you are thinking for them, or you're thinking about them as they relate to your unconscious. And so you are vicariously living out through their, how you have judged their identity within your own ego. And you can do this as a diversion from having to burden the weight of your own cornered emergent response that would properly correspond and contend against your primary counteroffer, because there is a natural agitation, because they're cornered. The one emotional tone in the emergent response is going to be destructive of the primary counteroffer. The one is going to essentially translate into the other. One is going to be on the descendant, while the other is on the ascendant. One is going to be waxing while the other one is waning. And essentially, this codependency breaks that. Then you can have a kind of, by investing in this particular conundrum of codependency, or sort of having this external and internal locus of control that you are sort of also then sort of, what's the word that means sort of it's a kind of fragmentation, but it's a fragmentation that probably isn't as severe as narcissism in terms of the ego's fragmentation. It's a kind of fragmentation which is being serviced by the collusion of the unconscious side of the mind. So it's a kind of unconscious collusion, or it might even be unconsciously driven. So in some sense, the ego becomes, in some sense, the non-cornered emergent response becomes the puppet of the unconscious. And what this also means is that the structure of and this might also be how the unconscious side of the mind then gets access to the subconscious through developing the structure in the ego, and then having that structure be replicated in the subconscious. And in some sense, the unconscious might even be more interested in trying to have a hand over what the content of the stimulus or the subconscious, before even caring about actually the ego. The ego might just be sort of the means to an end. And so the ego is really just is a clearinghouse, is a conduit for the unconscious to get to the subconscious. But anyway. Stop my recording. Okay, I was just need to collect where I was. I can't exactly remember exactly where I was, but I mean, look, I think that what I've just said might be a viable permutation into one of the variable possibilities, that essentially the unconscious side of the mind is seemingly driving these things. There might be other viable variances in which there's a joint collusion between the unconscious and the ego, and it's much more of a kind of tag team. It's much more and in some sense, the cornered emergent response is actually insulating itself by using the other emergent response as a target, as a reference point. And so you can you're actually accessing your emergent response, you're accessing your own cornered emergent response vicariously by seeing yourself as the identity of the non-cornered emergent response, but in the personage of somebody else, so that it's a kind of indirect access to your own cornered emergent response, which means that whenever your emergent response is corresponding to your own primary counteroffer, it doesn't detract from you. it is associated as a belief that is being recorded in as your judgment, your ego is tracking it as the blame of somebody else. So you're accessing your own metagram circuitry vicariously and using other people as the totem to absorb the egoic responsibility. And so you never develop your own kind of internal locus of control, because you've outsourced that internal locus of control that you are only emulating via, in some sense, it's almost like the opposite of narcissism. It's that instead of having your own introjective paradigm and your own introjective projections onto other people, you are pretending that other people are the ones contending introjective projections onto you. And so that you are receiving this as a naive or an innocent, that you are getting the signal from. So in some sense, you are projecting narcissism onto other people, but a narcissism that is using your own internal circuitry. So you're projecting your own internal circuitry onto other people who are ostensibly using it relative to your own egoic framing of them. But it's an imposition from them to you. You are not doing your judgment. In your judgment, you aren't doing the judging act. They are doing the judging act. And therefore you have a fragmented ego. Therefore you have this superimposition between an internal locus of control and an external locus of control in an interlaced, interwoven confusion, a fundamental kind of solipsistic muddle. And so, there are probably lots of nuances here that amount to various different kinds and species of autism. I was going to give an anecdotal story when I was thinking about how to present on this earlier. That, I have been around autistic people when I was in my late teens and early 20s. The autistic young children that I have been involved with doing what's the word? Sort of what's it called when you, or like being in a kind of like an au pair, and I have always had, the parents of these children, in terms of this kind of shadow work that I did, always remarked quite notably, but that's just a way to confirm what I'm about to say, that I could tell that essentially it's very easy for me at least, I think, to inspire young autistic children to develop, and sometimes it's not always easy, because sometimes you do need to, I might not be able to recreate this kind of thing. I don't know. A lot of this is kind of, is very sort of ephemeral. But I think that young autistic children, you can get a lot of development out of them, just because of kind of acting in such a way that garners a kind of admiration, and then from that admiration they essentially evolve towards being able to participate more fully with you, essentially. You could call that a kind of charisma, that you can kind of just by charisma, you can develop. Now, slightly older autistic children, you can be completely out of luck, because at that point, and I mean this even sort of probably from the age of 13 and 14 is when it starts to calcify. Once you've got a sort of a 14-year-old, and especially, certainly by the age of 16, I have even been able to break the spell of an autistic adolescent who was about 16 or 17 years old, had a full conversation with me. And this was an autistic person that supposedly, you know, did not even speak at all, and had a full on complete set of discourse with me. But you know, that doesn't mean anything, because in some I don't know if I can remember all the facets of that particular case, but there's actually a kind of calcified cynicism that they are now, they have metastasized, in the sense that whatever that they were doing has now been justified both ways. It's been there's a very open collusion. It's gone from having a kind of somewhat a naive nascence to a very kind of bad faith. It's not nascence anymore. It's been patently, it is a conspiracy at that point. And once that dynamic, once that mechanism starts operating consciously as an active strategy of managing the environment, you have to break down cynicism. And it's very hard to break down cynicism, because even though they might be able to have discourse with you, they're not going to ask you when you use a word that they don't understand. They're not going to ask you to define a word. They don't have the participatory. So it's you know, you really, the only way that you can ever move them is by kind of mind reading them. It's like trying to talk someone out of borderline personality disorder. It's not going to happen, because they can privately, unilaterally use any excuse to kick out the supporting leg or the substantiation of the chain of reasoning that you are showing to them, because they don't want to follow an alternative route. They are already actively perpetrating their strategy. It's no longer naive nascence. It's now in the state of an openly conspiratorial contrivance in some sense. And they also then have the added, because this is hard to say, but and I don't wish to. This is a complicated thing, so don't take this at face value. But I just want to quickly denote this: is that the kind of sympathy that they are able to extract from primary caregivers is a kind of codependency, which also, I mean, I don't wish to seem mean, but there are usually, there are Oedipal dynamics here. There are, but also, the priority of the child to secure their, you could call it survival strategy or coping mechanism that has evolved within the structure of this autistic mechanism, is now is too environmentally entrenched, and you're not going to have the resources to be able to show them an alternative route out of the maze, as it were. They are stuck in the labyrinth. So and they don't want to leave the labyrinth. It's their labyrinth, it's their home. So not only would it require so much work to show them that it is possible to escape the labyrinth, they also don't care to venture beyond it. So it's kind of, you're at an impasse. Suffice to say, at a certain age, it's almost like the lines from the Matrix. When a mind has reached a certain age, we don't try to unplug them from the Matrix, because they've already sort of given up the ghost, as it were. That's the sort of the line from Morpheus. Anyway, I just wanted to give that as a kind of anecdotal aside. But I would venture that it all has to do with these mechanics between the ego and the primary count, or the ego and the unconscious, the emergent response and the primary counter offer. With perhaps added complications of subconscious structures to do with the stimulus, which might also mean why in that particular case where this was an autistic person that, by all accounts, by their primary caregiver or whatever, that they hardly speak. They speak very, very little. But I got full paragraphs. I got full discourse. And they really are also, they are kind of hidden in this autistic avenue in their own mind, because the kind of imaginative projection which they are able to grant themselves in that kind of cocoon, which I'm guessing they are exploring something like a through the non-cornered emergent response. They are creating a virtual primary counter offer, and then they are kind of incepting themselves into that as a kind of engine of a matrix, or a computer that is generating an entire matrix, that they are just constantly devoting their primary, or their primary counter offer, their original primary counter offer, and their emergent response, their cornered emergent response, is just the conduit through which that they are connecting up with the virtual primary counter offer. And so they're kind of stuck in that forest, but you can share that surrounding with them. I mean, the problem is, and you do that in some sense, as I've said before, kind of through a kind of charisma, or through a kind of sensitivity that they know that you can see them in what they are doing, or are aware of what they're doing, and therefore they feel observed even in their incepted reality of the virtual primary counter offer. And so, because you're sort of in that same moment, you have access to them, but you don't necessarily have the rapport in order to actually, and not just the rapport, you don't necessarily have the what I'm just trying to say is that because there's a lack of a bridge, in that, words themselves, you have to share a medium, you have to share a language. And I mean, I'll just say that this is how I did it in practice, just so that people can get an image about how this works. But I think that you can't do this. This is not an act. You can't pretend to do this and you can't do this as a performance. You have to actually have the confidence of what you're doing, in that essentially you have conversations with them by talking to them and listening to the response that is not going to be verbal, but you can see it in their eyes, you can see it in their affectation, you can see something in their body language, something in their thought pattern that you can somehow discern. And if you can track that and monitor that, and in some sense, and it might not be that overtly interested in you. If the person is hungry or something like that, they're thinking about their next meal. They're not thinking about communicating with the person in front of them. But I mean, if you might be charismatic enough to be interesting, or more interesting, or equally as interesting as their own virtual inception in their own reality, then you're on the same plane But as I say, there's a lack of a medium of exchange. There's a lack of rapport. There's a lack of actual embodied dynamism. But and doing this essentially, and I mean, I wouldn't do it directly because a lot of the things that I would say would be questions, and those questions would be replaced by more questions. And a lot of those questions would be, do you know what this word means? Do you know what this word means? And giving definitions and things like that, because I believed that I was discerning a kind of um, uh, what's the word? Discerning not a full duplication of what it was that I was referring to. And then so as I would go into explaining what it was that I was asking, I would also repeat the general context so that it was very clear what the immediate thing that I was impressing upon them to get answer to. And I was taking their answers from their communication because I believe that there was a form of communication happening there. So in some sense, that's a faith-based assessment. And if you don't have the confidence, and perhaps there actually has to be something really going on there, because if you are saying things that are completely mismatching with what's going on internally and they're cogniting about what's happening, then you're just sort of you're traumatizing them perhaps, or you're agitating them. You're just kind of applying friction and hoping to get some movement from them. And I mean, the reason why I did this was because I assumed that this person could not speak, that this person didn't develop language in such a good way that they could even have a discourse or an exchange. And so, it was very interesting when he started speaking, and it was just a torrent of, it was paragraph after paragraph after paragraph somewhat responding to the questions that I had asked and making points about the questions that I had asked, but in a kind of, in his own treatment of it, in his own view of these things. So he was kind of, because that's essentially what I was doing, is I was trying to make inroads into mapping what the construction of his strategy in his worldview was, or what his kind of purpose was, or something like that. And I was just following into, I was going into what it seemed to me, or I was asking about what it seemed to me. And I mean, I started very, very broadly. I mean, I was only asking very, very abstract and broad sort of universal questions, and giving context to those universal questions. So I believe that in some sense that my questions were, if nothing else, were arming him or giving him the ammunition to be able to articulate something like a worldview, because it was my initial presupposition that what autism in fact was a very complicated and developed structure in personality that was so developed and structured that essentially it missed out on developing essentially the mechanisms by which that people would be able to engage with one another in any kind of direct fashion, although obviously there's a lot of indirect communication because of that most people, even if mature and well developed, will have problems of sort of confabulation caused by the incongruence between the unconscious and the ego and such, or subconscious structures that are creating disunity or disjunction between the components or whatever, of the sides of the mind and such. Anyway, perhaps I've jumped too quickly into weaving those anecdotes into these models about what I think is actually going on. I mean, it could be that all these things are actually much more premised within the stimulus, within the subconscious. Again, I think that I'll revisit all of these topics when I've thought about the subconscious independently, or try to explore and develop my view about what the subconscious is doing in conjunction with the primary counter offer and the emergent response. Anyway, yeah. So I think that what makes this such a troubling thing to try to describe is that the ego itself is so in control of itself that it can create many different types of paradoxes, and there's also a potentiality of a myriad complexity in its own sort of self fragmentation or disruption, or kind of the distribution, even if that's a kind of incongruent distribution of its own, that essentially there is a valid term as metacognition, because how you egoistically, or how you judge, how you have a judgment about how it is that you are thinking, is going to have an impact on your thinking as well, but an indirect impact on from a kind of almost metaphysical, or in the same way that a priori philosophical commitments have certain perhaps unforeseen and unintended consequences in your a posteriori, kind of reasoning or rationalization, and sort of giving up on. I mean, the simpler way of talking about this is the important distinction between having a properly developed internal locus of control and comporting the boundary between external and internal locus of control, and knowing and hopefully philosophically developing the experiential wisdom, but also that confirms this, but also the faith commitment that the external locus of control is a fundamentally invalid or stultifying category. It's a noxious, insidious sort of abrogation of one's own intellect, to the extent to which that it actually dissolves it into an intractable paradox, which you end up sort of suffering the consequences thereof. In myriad fashion, perhaps as sympathetic psychopathologies that result in malformed structures in the subconscious that mirror what's going on in the ego, but essentially that you can reduce everything that's happening into the ego pretty well, or that there's maybe one exception to that, which is that maybe the unconscious, as in some sense as the representative of the superego, in the positive side of the minds, in the false ego complex, I could clean that up, but it's so much talking to clean that up with technical things. But I could take a crack at it now. But essentially, I think that completely confirms what I was talking about earlier when I was saying that relative to the unconscious, or at least that the ego has merged itself with the superego. Well, and then I later on extrapolated that into, well, actually, it's because the unconscious is using the ego as a conduit just to get to the subconscious. And therefore, relative to the unconscious, the ego and the superego might as well be a conglomerated paradigm relative to the unconscious, and how the unconscious is treating the ego as a conduit to get its hands on the subconscious. Because as long as it can control the subconscious, as in being able to literally confer to itself or bestow itself with designed affectations that have definitive and premeditated consequences or outcomes, that then you get to enjoy that affect in however you so choose. That sort of fundamentally dissolves the boundary of the superego, in lending it to the power of the unconscious. To put this in a kind of in a narrative example, this would be where if the Merovingian gets to obtain the eyes of the oracle, and in some sense he might as well become the king of the machine world, at least how the machine world relates to the matrix itself, becomes a kind of overlord from within the matrix, from the positive side of the false ego complex, from the unconscious, gets to dominate the superego. In some sense, it's a form of integration of the superego, but it's an integration that comes at the cost of any coherence in the ego. The ego loses its coherence. It loses proper delineation between boundaries, and it in some sense is fundamentally merged with the superego, but not in an integrated way, in a disintegrated way, but in a way in which that disintegration is localized to the ego, where the ego is just used as a tool to connect and be just simply a conduit for the unconscious. So the ego is not the proper seat of consciousness, and the inferior function of the ego is not properly holding the requisite accountability that proper integration that is sufficient for a proper integration. Okay, so I think that is now this all leads back to the issue of virtual primary counteroffers, which there might be two varieties. There might be virtual counteroffers. I mean, I was thinking, and now this is very speculative, and so please, this must be taken with a large grain of salt. I was just thinking, maybe bipolar type 1 people are kind of very, very special, because maybe they are the ones who have access to these independent emotional tones, which are untethered from their blood and untethered from karma, and can somewhat be relied on, but they're going to be quixotic, they're going to be problematic if you have no way to manage that access. You have to bring it back to your own normal metagram circuitry, your regular metagram circuitry. Otherwise, you were just creating some kind of psychosis or some kind of fracture between two worlds that can't properly coincide. They can't properly correlate to one another in a healthy way that it can actually be properly transcribed back into karma, as it were, back into the blood. So you kind of, anyway, so that could be said a bit neater. But if it is true that bipolar is the one who has the most access to an unadulterated independent emotional tone, that perhaps these are the people perhaps that these are the gifts in the communion, that that there are these distinct gifts: the gift of the apostle, the gift of the priest, the gift of the evangelist, of the prophet. Perhaps each of these things, perhaps any of them, if properly accessed, has view of the others as well to some degree, but is especially enlightened with the ability to embody and transcribe from the ether, as it were, into karma, into the blood, this manna from heaven that can be shared. in the sharing of faith and in the sharing of the communion or something like that. Anyway, so that's a speculation that maybe, you know, bipolar people are something like the portal through which these particular strong gifts can sort of, that we can get a window into seeing them, or the potential of these unadulterated emotional tones can be seen, or at least glimmers of them can be seen, until ways are devised in order to structurally give us stable access to them because of properly integrated self-actualization, or, you know, the ascended man, as it's called in the scripture, and the work of salvation. And that there are some people who have these very powerful spiritual gifts that they are capable of sharing with others, or as they are in a kind of collective network within the communion, and these powers are available to those who are linked up with them, you know, and you know, it might not also be that exclusive to that you must have this particular emotional circuitry in order to have access. You know, as many people as have dreams have access to the gift of the prophet, for instance. So it might be that the gift of the prophet is even unknown to a bipolar person themselves, who might be this particular kind of embodiment of the spiritual gift, which they themselves don't have access to because they are not properly doing the work of salvation and not fully self-actualized. But their actions have within them that gift which is at work, and so it's there for other people to discern and for other people to dream, etc., on to dream on these things. And so we dream dreams that are perhaps the gift of the prophet, that are not messages to be delivered for us, but are messages for others, perhaps, etc. Although these things do often find themselves quite honed when one is reporting one's dreams to a particular vessel of blessing, when you are in some kind of structure of a communion. Anyway, so this thing about having a virtual primary counter offer, which in some sense would be open to anyone who just has two emotional tones in their emergent response, but it's perhaps capable of being internally integrated and properly accessible to people that have the more atomized stimuluses, that don't have cornered stimuluses, because as soon as you have a cornered stimulus, that means that you only have one impetus from the subconscious in order to machine or work your own emergent response. And because the subconscious is always a reflection or a parallel to the emergent response, because the subconscious is a parallel to the ego, that if the ego is cornered, then the emergent response is going to have a stable structure, and it's the stability of the emergent response that is going to make the lack of juxtaposition possible in order to transcribe from the potential virtual primary counter offer into the blood of the actual metagram circuit, that you will either be lost in the autism of the virtual primary counter offer, or you won't engage in the virtual primary counter offer because your subconscious structure will guide you towards stabilizing you in having proper internal correspondences between the subconscious, I just misspoke, between the emergent response and the unconscious, between the primary counter offer and the cornered emergent response. So if your subconscious is leading you into having this fixed correlation or the stable correlation between the cornered emergent response and the primary counteroffer, then you've got a stable unconscious and ego, that it is probably going to be contending some version of an internal locus of control. But you see, it's not the same thing as other people who are actually able to battle between the spiritual battle between the internal locus of control and the virtual primary counteroffer. Because if you are in that battle, then you are able to, in some sense, steal the fire from the gods. You're able to be the proverbial. Oh my word! Why can I never remember names? The friend of man, the demigod. What is his name? Oh my word! Who stole the fire of the gods to give to man, that has his liver pecked out every day as it is regrown. I can't remember the Greek god, or demigod. I think it starts with a P. I can't remember. I'm sure everyone knows, really, the myth, the Greek myth that I'm referring to. Anyway, did he have his liver pecked out by a crow or by a raven? I wonder. Which was his punishment given to him by Zeus for giving the fire of the gods to man. Anyway, okay, so that motif, by the way, I think is something like the work of salvation for someone with this kind of circuitry. Is that is, in some sense, the quality of their life is that they are this kind of demigod that is trying to bring the fire of the gods from the proverbial Greek pantheon to man. Anyway, I mean, on some level, it could also be the motif that corresponds to the life of any prophet, as is said in the scriptures, that a prophet will never be accepted in his hometown. I can't remember the exact phrasing, but people will know the scripture that I'm referencing. Anyway, I mean, there's also similar kind of things in the Hindu scripture, which talks about the introspective sage that is asleep during the day and awake at night, working on his spiritual duty, essentially. But anyway, the introspective sage, which I mean, I guess in the Christian scripture, this motif could also be the fear and trembling of working out one's salvation. Anyway, that was a bit of a rambly rabbit hole, but what am I talking about? Let me go back to the topic of what. Yeah, so I am now speculating also that people with subconsciouses that only have cornered emotional tones that make up their stimulus, that have two emotional tones in their stimulus which are in a corner with one another, that those people will tend very quickly towards having a stable. In fact, they might actually, it might not be perfectly stable. It might have two modes. It might sort of have one, it goes in one direction until until a switch is flipped, and then it goes in the other mode. And so they might still have access to two, but not concurrently, whereas the bipolar type 1s have access to both somewhat concurrently. And so it's a much more of a fluid balancing act, which is much more nuanced in being able to pierce the veil, as it were, in being able to see the door of truth, somewhat depicted in Full Metal Alchemist quite brilliantly, if I do say so myself, about my supposed autobiographical input into that project. Anyway, I can understand how a scandalous thing, saying things like this must sound. I mean, I just sound like a sort of charlatan or a crackpot. But perhaps I do suffer from delusional memories, perhaps. But at some point, perhaps there will be evidence out there to either corroborate or anyway, let me not speculate down that self-pitying rabbit hole. But okay, let me just deal with the issue at hand. Okay, so I think that might be the extent to which that I might be able to talk about what I've been thinking about in the refinement of this issue. I do need to give it a proper refined explanation in simpler terms about the codependence and about the projection and about the different sort of potentially the different mechanisms of projection that happen within the ego, but that might also be bespoke to the metatype. That might be all controlled by what by the metatype, by the actual cognitive functions that make up the particular ego. And so with reference to that, it might become much more obvious and clear that essentially some of the overarching structures are coming from the metatype anatomy that is performing or that is performing the judgment. And you know, sort of the particular dominant function involved, the particular parent function involved, the particular child function involved, and the particular inferior function that is being sort of completely sold by the ego into the midst of, or into being ravished and into being projected on by the superego, which is sort of colluding with something like the dominant function of the ego. At least in the case in which the unconscious dominant and parent function is the driver and is in some sense which is another way of saying that the virtual primary counteroffer is creating a vortex around itself which is absorbing the metatype itself, but also the pre-existing metagram circuitry that came before the development of that virtual primary counteroffer is all being vortexed in being just mere satellites to serve the access to the virtual primary counteroffer, which is obviously substituting for the person's actual metagram's predominant or first or original primary counteroffer, which is being supplanted, and that supplanting is being structured into a kind of So it could perhaps also be described perhaps like a kind of possession, a kind of spiritual possession. But I also wanted to make some political points that as we have normalized a lot of very unhealthy, what I've often termed as proto-fascistic and fascistic authoritarian cultural, sort of cultural norms and mores and standards in society, the use of double standards. I mean, this can be seen, there's so many legal cases that I think are perfect examples of this, sort of the kind of prosecutorial misconduct because of trying to serve the ideology of the identity politics groupthink. And, just how essentially when you have these norms in society that are normalized, when you have these fascistic norms that are normalized, and what they call the Covington kids, where essentially, where these children were vilified on Twitter and social media because there was an American Indian who was singing a song in front of their faces, and they were just sitting there in silence, but somewhat trying to smile and be calm. And essentially, this was rebranded that the children were the aggressors, and this American Indian activist was being hounded by these people he was just trying to stoically sing his activism song, and he was being set upon by these children who were like wearing a MAGA hat, I think, when it was actually the complete, there was a complete inversion of reality, and in some sense it was the American Indian man who was singing this American Indian song in his activism who was the passive aggressive person who walked up to these children in order to agitate them, in order to, in some sense, provoke them, and they were merely resisting being provoked by just being silent and smiling and looking at this kind of, this entitlement of being a provocateur and in some sense implicitly casting an accusation, an ideological accusation against these children. I guess because one of them was wearing a MAGA hat or something. And that, so the normalization of passive aggressiveness, because you can already just kind of assume that your self-righteousness and your sanctimoniousness is guaranteed. Is, I think, the mark of this umbrella ego, of this ego that serves over everyone, and that the sky ego is the same sky ego that everyone in your ideologically possessed universe is tethered to, and therefore it is strength in its number. It is, it is strong because it's a legion of consensus, and that legion of consensus therefore cannot be questioned. And I think that is how all autism and how all, what I've also described, and I've also labeled it as a kind of solipsism, but also how all fragmentation or discombobulation or a kind of fundamental incongruent dishonesty or self-deception, that's how it gets away with itself, is that basically it gives itself a token of credibility, which it says is, well, I have the consensus position, so I don't actually have to have an internal locus of control that can substantiate this, because the internal locus of control is their ideological target that they deride, that they attack, that they go and agitate and go and be passive aggressive against. And once you've normalized that kind of passive aggressiveness, you've got an ever increasing propensity towards psychological destabilization, because you've given people license within the culture to go and plague whoever they so wish until they fall in line with the narcissistic, kind of general program. And until they conform with the ideological tokenage and virtue signaling and of conformity and agreement to it and with it. And so, the transgression against the liberal order, the libertarian philosophical liberal tradition and political order, is another way of saying the assault on the internal locus of control and individual responsibility and its displacement with a kind of codependency. Yeah, and once you have this, I think, probably set up in subconscious structures, you've got a kind of engine of bad faith, and you've got also a thing that you can teach young people, because you can instruct young people in such a way, you can give them educational training in such a way that they are already primed into how to manifest their psychological anatomy, or how to structure the rest of their psychological anatomy. And so I think that you give people role models as to how the contents that their subconscious should contain, and that will put them in good stead, or it will perhaps it will mislead them, it will put them in the wrong direction. And right now, sort of the cultural zeitgeist is essentially a fascist, is an authoritarian fascist, is an identity politics fascist. And the only way to actually be correct in its eyes is that you have to be the right kind of fascist. You have to share in the right vilification of the right scapegoat. That's the only thing that actually promulgates any form of agreement that they can even have with one another, which is essentially another way of saying you must conform. And we can bully you until you do so. We give ourselves the license to bully you until you do so. And we can engage in as much passive aggressiveness as we so wish. And, there's no more decorum, there's no more etiquette that bars that kind of egregious and juvenile behavior, essentially. And there are also ways of translating that juvenile behavior into rationalization, into pseudo-intellectual arguments that sort of don't really pick up after themselves. They just kind of, they keep on repeating things inanely. They don't listen, everything becomes a kind of one-way filter that just keeps on confirming itself. It's not dynamic at all in how it doesn't properly refute the other claim, and it doesn't seem to properly want to understand the other claim. It just wants to get into interrupting the other claim because there's no alternative, and so it's not capable of thinking of an alternative position. It's not capable of creating another model. This is why I'm always confident when I criticize other people, is because I painstakingly try to actually understand exactly what their position is. I emulate it inside my own mind, and I try to confirm with whether my emulation of it is correct. But as I am emulating it in a conceptual sense, I'm not letting it possess me, but I am giving it, I am imagining that I'm letting it possess me so that I can see how it works, that I can see what it does, and all the facets about it, and how it works in totality, and how, and if you do that, then you also need to create a third iteration of understanding, which is the potential synergy, or the potential integration between your core beliefs and your core understanding and this alternative that there's always possible for that you have to create a bridging understanding of how you might come to a meeting place, or a direct meeting of the minds, where there will either be an impasse or a refutation. And that is how I think that we can actually if people kind of practice that to some degree, you will be able to either get to a point where you can agree to disagree, or where someone will make a convincing point that the other person might have to take some great time in order to properly assimilate into their own schema, psychological schema and structure. And this is why development takes a very, very long time. And what I've just described, I think, is the process that is described in the communion of breaking the bread and drinking the wine, which is the blood of each other, and the bread is the understanding of each other, and eating it twice, digesting it, excreting it, and eating it yet again, eating it a second time, after having processed it fully, eating it a second time. That is how the bread is broken. That is how the fleshly thinking gets broken. Therefore. Okay, anyway, I've spoken surely for long enough. Interesting breakthroughs, perhaps, or I still need to focus more about what the stimulus is actually doing. That will perhaps give me a much, hopefully, simpler tools to expand on all these things and work out all the different potentialities in terms of how different circuits are doing different things. But it might be the correspondence with metatype itself that fills in a lot of the blanks. That the metagram circuitry structure stuff is perhaps, I shouldn't perhaps try to be too descriptive about it, because a lot of that descriptive mass, I should be perhaps more abstract, because how that abstraction will then apply to the particular metatype anatomy of the particular cognitive functions will then fill in the more pertinent particular details. Okay, this is a further addendum. I just want to return to what I was talking about, working with autistic, specifically autistic people, but specifically the sort of non-lingual autistic adolescent. And then I want to use that as a springboard to talk about the general strategies of bad development, or let's say strategies of juvenile delinquency, I guess, which are not really age bound, in that people sort of develop a kind of delinquency and they never stop being juvenile in the different species, perhaps, just to talk about this issue, but more broadly. So I was going to start off by sort of, in retrospect, criticizing myself for maybe changing how I would have done things in hindsight, but then I thought, no, actually, perhaps I shouldn't fault myself for that, because that mistake was perhaps was potentially an instructive. It was itself the embodiment of a pedagogical kind of lesson, that, because this was the thing that he complained of in some respect when he started talking to me, is that and by the way, our exchange went very deep, because when he was talking and when I was talking to him, there was a lot of back and forth, and it was very deep, and it seemed to me that his problem was cynicism. That's why he was the way he was, and why he did not care to alter his behavior, is because he was essentially, it was a kind of cynicism that had percolated up into a crystallized sort of solidification. But and then my metaphor of the labyrinth is relevant, but essentially what I was perhaps misreading in my communication with him, and you see that what I mean by this is the seed of a pedagogical lesson that needs to be learned, is that communication itself is not perfect. And the only way that you can sort of overcome and bridge that imperfection is by engaging and participating and by essentially having a kind of trust that in the ongoing unfolding of the dance or of the performance or of the expression in the imperfect medium, that these things can hopefully be resolved. That it's about essentially a good hope and a good faith that it's worth sharing trust with people, and that trust is an engaged participatory sort of project that's outside of yourself, and that you don't have full control over, but you have to kind of allow your hands to get a bit dirty in working with it. So, and that requires a kind of humility and also a kind of awareness, but an allowance of a kind of vulnerability or susceptibility to a kind of performative imperfection. Now, what I misread when I was having the one-way communication with him, where I was just trying to read his responsiveness to it, and where I was slightly misreading some of the time, because I couldn't tell when he stopped listening or when he disengaged, or he seemed, because I believe I was very aware of his level of interest, but I wasn't aware of the subject to which the interest pertained. And so I thought he was following me, and I thought that because I was making a very methodical, philosophical sort of thing, and his interest was in some things and not in other things, because he already had contentions against what I was saying, but he didn't speak them at the time. And so he had already sort of kicked out the stand from underneath my entire edifice that I was presenting to him as a potential shared medium in which that we could start to openly communicate. And because he wasn't following me precisely, or because he wasn't sort of following me in my chain of reasoning, he had already sort of ejected from it, he was still interested in the things that I was saying. And so sometimes when he lost interest into some tangents, which I was going into explaining something that went on, that was a leg of a leg of a leg of something that I had already proposed, because I thought that his waning lack of interest was misunderstanding, and so I was seeking to solve misunderstanding. And then, when he wasn't interested in that, I thought that, well, he didn't understand yet again, so let me explain the subcomponents of the last explanation. And actually, I think that maybe I'm slightly misremembering, because I do think that I did catch on to this issue of his, that it was a problem of interest and not a problem of understanding. But the problem was also that it is a problem of vocabulary, I think. But so there were some things that perhaps all my efforts were not in vain, as it were. But so, I mean, I was very surprised when he started talking. He made such sweeping, broad, abstract points. Just how well he followed these kinds of topics, or these sorts of topics. Although he didn't have the same language and treatment of them as I did, he was in that realm. He was in that vicinity. But sort of language is a tricky bridge to maneuver with someone who is not practiced in exchanges. And it was the hardest thing, really, to explain how everything that he had, when he was talking, that everything that he said did conform with what I was describing, that I did essentially anticipate what exactly the structure of his problem was, and that everything that I said was pertinent, essentially. But drawing the bridge between what I was saying and his rebuttal, as it were, or his counterpoint, or because in some sense it was something of a contest of styles or a contest of intellect. I mean that not in terms of intelligence, but no, well, actually, technically, yes, in terms of intelligence, in that his methodology or his schema, his personality schema, was rational, and he considered it rational, and he considered it the most rational, and I essentially took great pains to explain how just because something is rational doesn't mean that it's correct. And he did get that point, but he simply didn't care. And that was sort of the impasse at the end of it. And he did consider his strategy to be more rational, and that was anyway. But this had other implications and other ramifications, because I don't think we were talking, because I was able to deliver basically the same argument or the same point, but not talking about rationality, but talking about reason or goodness or morality or integrity and the use of integrity. And that was essentially the polemic that I was raising to him, as to grow and develop integrity, and he was essentially not really that interested. Because that kind of topic is exactly sort of the topic that is the development of an internal locus of control, and essentially he saw that only as a kind of as a distraction from him getting what he wanted in his kind of more solipsistic sort of thing. And at that point I saw his obstinacy as essentially a kind of toxicity, and I knew that he understood the disagreement between us, and he simply just didn't care. And at that point I essentially relinquished, and I mean, I did see him months later, after perhaps because it was reported to me that he seemingly was different after that he was slightly crestfallen in some way or something like that, and I sort of rehashed when I spoke to him again. We went into it again, we trotted out the whole sort of thing, and it was essentially the same impasse. Anyway, and look, I don't want to be sort of too mean about this, and perhaps make excuses for people, but I do think that therefore the problem was slightly environmental. That the token of development that I was encouraging him towards was essentially, it was the problem of escaping from the labyrinth when the labyrinth is one's home. That to want to escape it means that you already have to see an immediate ulterior source of convenience and comfort or sustenance and support. And essentially the thing that I'm modeling is both not only unknown, it's also the level of discomfort to which one might be exposed is an uncertainty, and therefore the cause of a kind of and I don't but in some sense I don't think that this was his thinking directly, but it was essentially his thinking indirectly, at least unconsciously, in the sense that to reject the hand that otherwise does everything for you is a, it's sort of like the monkey that holds the fruit in the trap, where the hole in the trap is just big enough for the monkey to place the hand into the trap, but holding the fruit cannot take the hand out of the trap. And the monkey will not let go of the fruit. The proximate prime, that you don't, with such a trap, you don't need to place a manacle around the monkey. The monkey will not let go of the fruit. It'll be, the monkey will generate its own shackle to the trap. And that, I think, is essentially the choice that's anyway, that he was locked in. And there is a way around that to make the environment different, but in some sense people have to choose not to be monkeys. Essentially, they have to choose not to be proximate, sort of addicted to some process that delivers to them some automatic bestowed pseudo-integrity or integrity substitute, or they have chosen a kind of worldly trust above and beyond the internal dignity which was there if you only choose it. Okay, so I was going to use this as a springboard. Okay, so I think that therefore there are two types of, okay, let me just talk about another topic that weaves into this a little bit, but it's a bit of a strange aside. It's a strange topic. But someone recently was talking to me about cryptocurrency, not really talking to me. They were probably trying to sell me something, but it just made me think about currency itself, and I think that this is a useful example to use, money. At the end of the day, what is money? And money is one thing above all, metaphysically speaking, or psychologically speaking. Money is faith. Money has nothing without faith driving it. People that will have faith that the money is valuable gives it its value. And I think this is also obvious in terms of sort of cryptocurrency, because sort of the only thing that keeps it holding its value and keeping it afloat is that so many people are interested in negotiating with that as their medium, or engaging through it and with it, and interested in it, and that kind of general consensus about its popularity or about its utility is what gives people faith in it. They don't perhaps necessarily have direct faith in it, they have a kind of vicarious faith about it, seeing how other people are so willing to be interested in it. And in some sense, the only reason why the money that governments use is valuable is because they have the worldly power, the coercive measures, the monopoly on violence to essentially enforce a kind of a faith-based acceptance of the value of their fiat currency. Okay, so trying to find a mechanism that allows one to command at least allow one to consider that there is a command value about the faith that one should have in something in an environmental context gives you a model to some degree about how some people might not have, because this person that I was talking about, this person to some people, how I've just described it, and how I've just, I've said that no, this person is blameworthy for their moral their culpable commitment to their autism. But let me not be so harsh, seemingly morally judging someone like this. But let me say that other people, there are so many people who are exactly this kind of juvenile, exactly this kind of reprobate, in my judgment. Only they aren't willing to do it by themselves. At least the autist, at least the solipsistic autistic person who does this does so in their own mind. They haven't perhaps tried to use excuses external to them as the cause, or as to say, no, well, that's the purpose of my reasoning for investing into a kind of, and I know that this is oxymoronical to say, a collective solipsism, which is, I think, is what sort of worldly rationalization can, in a spiritual, metaphorical way, how it can be legitimately described. A fortified solipsism that one feels through the false authority that there is a worldly consensus around it and about it. Because it's practical enough, it's a practical enough way to command faith. It's something that carries a kind of pseudo-faith impulsion. It's a kind of propitiation. So it's a sort of, it's a faith in blind faith. It's a faith mechanism to croon yourself towards investing into a blind faith. Now, these things are different, but I think that they're essentially morally equivalent. Whether you, in your own right, commit to your solipsism or sort of disconnection from integrity, whether you do that, or whether you are getting into a kind of language game with other people who can parrot the same false authority, can sort of collude in corroborating on the subject matter or on the topic of credentials and sufficient credentials to make certain claims. And these things are essentially outsourced into a kind of statistical aggregation of reality. And then, you know, rationalization upon rationalization says, well, I'm rational in my rationalization, and we have all these rational instruments confirming, you know, and then we have the kind of something like the Newtonian Ponzi scheme, where we understand nothing, but we can model everything in a medium that we don't know the truth value thereabout. But hopefully when the last piece of the logical puzzle is found, then everything will but you know, we're in the middle of the Ponzi scheme, so don't judge us just yet, and we're the best thing that we have going on in this world, so have sympathy with us and screw you if you don't conform. That is sort of the nature of the Leviathan of the seas of the world, and in some sense which can also distract itself in the dead matter of the residue of the lost purposes of everyone who is sacrificed towards trying to bring dignity to this whore of a collective soul project. That the collective soul of this Leviathan, of this monstrosity of the seas, is in fact a prostitute, and the chaff of the residue of the prostitutes that have come before them, which essentially seem like jewels and treasure to the new generation of prostitute, will collect the ashes that eventually burn away and settle as the salt that fills the ocean. The former life of the world collects in this oscillating movement of troughs and crests, in a continuously monotonous oscillation and vacillation, you know, of tides, and it looks alive. You know, it has the content of life, but it's just water with salt from things that were formerly living. And the movement is so organic that you might believe that it's a living thing, but it's not a living thing, it's a dead thing. And the movement that that exists within itself is essentially its environment acting upon it. It is the gravitational force of the moon acting against it that seemingly gives it its seasonal and organic rhythms, and as a kind of as a in a vague and hollow reproduction of the breathing of some respiratory organ of some animal. It's not in any respiration. It's merely dead, but it seems alive. And when other people look at that large agglomerated mass of somewhat associated rationalization, somewhat the ionic structure in a fluid that is conjoined in the same briny petri dish of electrolyte, one just merely hopes that, oh, well, maybe if I can add my salt to that, and maybe then the last piece of the puzzle will be found, and we'll have an alignment, and we'll have a kind of unimatrix or something like that. And then you, while you're on that project, you go on validating, sort of all these coercive faith measures or whatever. Okay, anyway, okay, this is getting a bit in the weeds here with this very steeped and strained metaphor that gets quite abstract. But I'm just merely trying to link up slightly with the allegory which the scripture uses for the spiritual phenomena, because it is the sea that holds the dead. And the key to death and Hades will obviously be, sort of the voice that can call life from the death, that can convince. But in some sense, you're not judged by being able to be convincing. I mean, because in some sense, you cannot convince that which knows its own choice and continues to choose. You cannot change the wish, of the free entity. You can with some other tools, perhaps. You can with enough. Essentially, the mind itself, the psychology, addressing the psychology directly is not merely enough. You could do it. You could catch more, I would say, by role model. But establishing such a role model is tricky to do. I mean, I've devoted my whole life to it, in the form of the South African Constitution, in the form of my activism around judicial and political reform all over the world. In the form of my cultural commentary, in order to try to promote enough luminaries and thought leaders to be psychologically healthy enough to be good role models. Essentially, I do think there's direct pedagogical instruction, and then there is also the provision of a role model, because people can discern things for themselves if they just see it in action, as it were, or they are able to communicate about and with something that is sort of in in its elements. Um, people can see the confidence that some people have. They might be able to measure how some element of confidence is strong. I mean, I must say, there's something that I was missing from my last recording, which is anecdotally going into my own development of my own false ego complex, and seeing the kinds of developmental moves that I made and sort of what went wrong, so that I can try also to understand a bit. I mean, what's weird is that also what went wrong is that I was trying to break myself on purpose in order to better understand the component parts as well, and also to put myself in a better position to be able to emulate other people's psychology, so that I could model it, and I could, you know, trying to discover a deep theory of psychology is incredibly difficult, because in some sense you have to ask, well, is a knife capable of cutting itself? And I would argue that yes, psychology is something that is capable of cutting itself, but it's not an easy, the philosopher's stone is not an easy work to fulfill. The great work, as it's called in spiritual alchemy, which I'm essentially assessing from a mystical position of a also one could say from the apophatic tradition. Anyway, what I was going to say about myself is let me think about this topic. What was I was trying to get towards talking about this thing. I was going to talk about. Look, I mean, this is a slightly personal note. It's slightly clunky to place this here, but I mean, whenever my research seemingly hit a brick wall, whenever it seemed like I was not making progress towards a synthesis, I would get. I mean, in my weaker moments, I would. It's weird, because I would say that I wouldn't lose hope, but I would entertain the idea that this is all for naught. It's not going to come. It's not going to amount to anything, because the work itself was very, very hard. And so if you don't make progress for a long time, you think, well, is this the end? Is this the terminal point of the project that I have essentially devoted 28 years of my life toward, and I'm 35 years old. So, sort of this project is by far the majority of my effort and existence to a large degree, while also doing other things simultaneously. But this has been my prime purpose. And so, sort of if it looks like that's not going well, or if I'm at a kind of terminal point, or a potentially terminal point, it really makes me entertain, well, maybe it's okay, because maybe I'm just a delusional person. Maybe all my other memories are just crazy. And, that there are other explanations for this, because then it doesn't matter. Which is in some sense toying with the idea that my purpose is my prime self-created purpose, that I've been impelling myself, from my choice to take this route, as it were, in the service of greater things, and that it captures all my faith, to put into it that I question this faith when it seems that I might not be able to complete the task. because then maybe it means that the faith is still capable of being redeemed through somebody else's efforts, but sort of I am just too much of a broken vessel to carry it to pass, to carry it to the finish line. I mean, it also doesn't help, essentially. Well, it's not just the project itself. It's also the alienation, I guess, and the loneliness. The very strange kind of alienation, because there's certainly friendly people that I have access to, but the problem is just how painful my very strange and peculiar story is, just how long-winded it is to try to understand all of its stupid complexity of this kind of self-impelled sacrifice and trauma, a lot of which seems to be, I've always kind of trusted my method, as it were, but when that is the only trust that you have, and when it looks like your project might not come to fruition, then it kind of destabilizes, because I don't have any other sort of measure of support. Yeah, so I mean, I wouldn't need collateral support if my project just looked like it was constantly moving along. But anyway, I feel confident that the theory is in a good enough state that even if I was taken out of the equation, if something happened to me, that it could be completed by other people, that what I've laid down is substantive enough and rigorous enough that that gives me, I mean, it's not exactly solace that I've completed my task, but it gives me some stability in at least in my incarnated purpose, as it were. That there's a beautiful scripture which I've heard Peter Hitchens quote, which I can't remember the exact wording, but it's sort of, I'm going to completely butcher it. It's sort of, do with that what your hand is so ever, oh my word, it's basically sort of the injunction that whatever you're good at, you should put to good use, essentially, is what the meaning of the scripture is, I believe. Whatever you're good at, put it to good use. Work at it the most, as it were. And when I've doubted whether I could sort of live up to that scripture, I guess that directly corresponds with indulging into so much self-doubt that in order to escape the, I guess it's paradoxes and spirals and vortexes of, the shame of indulging in the self-doubt and the self-pity, and then that sort of leads me into thinking about my life in terms of the kind of alienation or loneliness that I'm not lonely if my memories are true, but if my memories aren't true, then I'm just a crazy person. And then what is the status of my project? So it's just, what does that say about the status of my project if I have all these other delusions? So it's just sort of propounding more self-doubt upon self-doubt. But, skepticism is there at hand always. It's the wolf that you feed, as it were, that matters. You always have two wolves inside of you, the good one and the bad one, or something like that. It is what you choose to give attention to and what you choose to do. But, this is what I do in my mind when it looks like that my research project is not making progress, or at least so little progress that then the doubt seems plausible enough that it would be irresponsible not to review it. Anyway, I think that this sounds eminently reasonable, but that is also the nature of the things of the sea, is that something is eminent about it. But it's interesting because, in looking at my own life in this way, it also hasn't, getting into the self-pity and the self-doubt and mapping it out and understanding it and trying to bring that to resolution it has been a useful tool as well, because there are things there that need to be worked through, even beyond the uncertainty around whether these are memories or delusions, whether I suffer from a special form of dissociative identity disorder, or if I really do have a very peculiar life and life experience, which is just essentially so unconventional and so unrelatable that it leaves me somewhat alienated and unable to share it. But at least not in a way that is actually edifying or useful or proactive in any true sense. It just kind of leaves more strange implication. And in some sense, I've often bemoaned that the fact that it seems to me that even if someone does believe in these stories and they listen to the stories, that it's not entirely good for their soul. It's not good for them to indulge into this so much. Although, I've even heralded my own self-pity and my own solace, in the words that I have had pop singers sing back to me from my writing. The song here that comes to mind is The Silence by the Bastille and The Weight of Living by the Bastille Band. Anyway, there's so many autobiographical songs that I have written. The Sweet Nothing of Calvin Harris, denoting the exchange, the sometimes sour exchanges that I've had with the people that I've made projects with, and Jackie and Wilson by Hosier, and also the Work Song by Hosier, all somewhat autobiographical. And that's really the tip of the iceberg, at least if my memories are correct. But the movies and the series and the Hollywood and the directing and the producing, although I really have a mixed reputation with directing, but at least in my memories. But the details that are in my mind are so strange that you would think that I wouldn't have so many negative memories if they were all contrived. But perhaps then that's just the explanation to my strange. The reason why I'm in this strange circumstance in my real life, in my day-to-day life, in my ordinary life, as opposed to my secret life, that perhaps the negative memories give some balancing context like that, but or explanation. But no, I don't really believe that. But anyway, I mean, that's the kind of, what's my point here? Oh, my point is that though, in trying to put the issue of is it real or is it surreal and delusional to one side, in dealing with some of these issues, past the indecision, just getting it pinned down, there is a kind of, there is a real question there that could be answered, that brings resolution. And I have found some of these things in delving into that self-pity, that because in some sense, I think that I personally have to heal as well in order to be healthy enough that I can look at my own mentality and imagine what a healthier mentality would work towards integrating, or something like that. Or that I've just said that in a very sloppy way, but essentially, my whole vision was that I would model my own psychology in such a detailed way, but also with references that encapsulated everybody else's psychological type, that then when I fully understood myself, I would simultaneously have the tools to be able to reverse engineer how to understand the components of other people. And I've essentially, I think I've largely succeeded in that, although I do need to make available publicly the 17 model, which is something that I will try to do shortly as well. But I'm also working on this latest breakthrough. Anyway, so I just wanted to say all those sorts of things. But yeah, I mean, it is perhaps useful to try to work out exactly where my developmental missteps were, even though a lot of those developmental missteps were done for a good reason, but for a strange reason, to just kind of break myself, to be broken so that I could have a broken thing of which to monitor and track and see what imbalances to understand the nature of the imbalanced internal structure. You can't understand a remote control by looking at a functioning remote control. You have to break it apart so that you can see all the component parts and try to remember how they were pieced together before you broke it apart. So that's the sort of, that's somewhat the outline of my particular personal journey in related to the larger journey. Or at least that's what I told myself I was doing. Perhaps I shouldn't be too confident that that is the true synopsis of what has happened. I certainly probed the possible alternative explanations that seem plausible, and even ones that just seem possible, I take a glance at. Anyway, I think that's enough blathering for one recording.